And since we heard from Michael a little bit, let's start with Will. And I think you heard Will as a principal. Will, would you tell us a little bit about yourself and your interest in liberal education?
Absolutely. Hi. Technically, I'm not a principal. I'm an assistant principal. So I just wanted to make sure that my credentials are in the right order. There's a great book by Diane Ravitch called Left Back. It's kind of a tome, but boy, it's an exciting tome because she takes you through the history of American education pretty much from the early part of this century all the way up until about 1975, maybe into the 80s. And it is a humdinger of a read. And I was always growing up with classical education with my father. We grew up in the South. If you hear a bit of an accent, that's my southern drawl coming through. We always had a picture of St. Robert E. Lee on the refrigerator. But my father always had classics everywhere, classical things everywhere. And so I grew up with this sort of steeped in this classical thing. And I went on to University of Dallas to finish my education. And there I read Diane Ravitch. And what really opened up to me there in reading her book was this sense of loss, tremendous loss. How much I had not been able to get. Even steeped in the classics with my father, I had lost this whole realm of thought and education. And I set myself the task and said, I'm not going to just sit there and say, oh, poor me, woe is me. I thought, I'm going to struggle out of this. I'm going to find this out. I'm going to go and find out what this education really looks like. What I found, as Diane Ravitch does point out in her book, is that really the classical education is about a sense of inquiry. Aristotle, based on Plato, says that all philosophy begins in wonder. And I've always wondered why he said that. That's a joke. Wonder, that sense of the world as somehow magnificent. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It shines forth like shimmering from chick foil and gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed, as Gerard Manley Hopkins says. That sense that the world is sparkling and alive, this childlike vision that every day is Christmas and everything is a Christmas present for me. That's something we lose along the way. At least I know I lost it. And to recover it, I think, is what the liberal arts is. It is a liberating art. It liberates us from that sense that this has to be this way. We have to be cogs in a machine. We have to get as you said, we have to get through chapter 23 or all is lost. No, it's not lost. And if it is lost, it can be found. So I got into this because I was so interested in this world that had been kind of denied me in my education. And only a few weeks ago, I had a student ask me, and I will end here. I tend to be very verbose, very loquacious, so I'm going to end here and pass it on because that's a miracle for me. I had a student ask me, a young 7th grader, ask me, Mr. Lassiter, you seem so he said smart, erudite. You seem so smart. Why did you ever get into education? And I thought, well, it wasn't for the money. I said to him, I got into it because I hate slavery in all its forms. And if you think about why you got into it too, it wasn't for the money, it wasn't for the fame. It's probably because you hate slavery too. The liberal arts are the freeing arts. They free us from slavery. And there's a great passage I came across in Virgil, and I know I'll misquote it, unless I whip out my second mind, my electronic heroin, which I won't do. He says, the road to hell is easy and smooth. Night and day the gates stand wide open, ready for you. But to find the right path and to struggle up into the open air, that is the work, that is the labor. And that's why I got into all
this. Just one other quick bio regarding Will, in case you want to talk to him later. He's new at this school, and it's a regular parish school outside of Minneapolis. just a regular parish school. But they were looking for something different. So he's come in and working with them, talking with them, thinking with them, becoming friends with them as they all kind of learn about this together. Is that relatively accurate?
That is very.
So he didn't walk into a school saying, this is a classical school from the get-go, or this is we have this firm mandate or anything like that. They're growing simply, I guess, maybe organically in the simple understanding of our intellectual heritage. So real quickly, I guess a couple of things I would like to bring up. One is my credentials. I'd like to be clear on those, because if I want to talk about classical education, I have to have some credentials. I am the grandfather of Achilles. How many of you have a grandchild named Achilles? It's pretty cool. I just am praying really hard that they don't name their next boy John, because their last name is Dewey. So, Achilles Dewey. It's kind of the antidote to John Dewey, huh? All right, so that's my credentials. My real path into the liberal arts, I went to college to learn how to surf. I literally chose to go to Thomas Aquinas College for one semester because I wanted to learn how to surf. And we don't do much surfing in Wisconsin. So I went out there and I actually stayed and fell in love with, one, the education, and two, this short, skinny, smart girl. And I guess after 4 years, I walked out saying I was liberally educated. Then I went to Virginia. I went out there for grad school and taught at a diocesan high school. And then I went to New Hampshire and taught up there. And then I went to Texas and I was a headmaster down there. And it was down there that I first really started to figure out what liberal arts was. So after 4 years of taking the liberal arts, living the liberal arts, and another 4+ years of teaching in a liberally arts-oriented manner, it just started to dawn on me, what was this all about? And here's what sort of opened the switch for me. It was the fact that I kept using these words that I wasn't familiar with. The trivium, the quadrivium, weird words. They never came up in my life before. Grammar, logic, rhetoric. What does that really, really mean? I mean, oh yeah, we all went to grammar school, but is it more than that? Logic is thinking clearly, that's fine. What the heck is rhetoric? So here I am, 7, 8, 9, 10 years into my life as a liberal educator, and I'm just awakening to the fact that there's something more. And in the subsequent years, as I really started to look at it, think about it, I'd start to pick up articles here and there. It's so much easier now with the internet. But I talked to people. I'm not much of a philosopher. So remember, I went to that school to learn how to surf. My brothers-in-law, they're really smart guys. One's a philosopher, one's a writer. But I would read little things, and little by little came up with an understanding. So that's what we all do in the pursuit of truth, and we do it as a community of learners. So I know, actually, one of the great articles I've read in the last few years was from your own bishop, who wrote an article talking about a faculty of friendship. Cultivate that in your schools, and base it on the highest things, and all of this will come. So this leads me back to my spark of different words. There's a wonderful new book, if any of you want to read it, by Father Giertych, the papal theologian, called The Spark of Faith. And we had the good fortune to be with him last summer. We were in his apartment, had Mass and cocktail hour and about a 7-hour-long dinner. He's a fascinating, fascinating man. And he wrote this book, Spark of Faith, because he sees the spark of a spark plug as such a great image of the kind of thing that has to happen in our faith life, in our intellectual life, in our personal lives. That spark plug, it fires things up. So let me just pose to you in closing, this word classical, it's a strange word. It sounds, I don't know what it sounds. It sounds old, it sounds elitist, it sounds undoable, it sounds Greek, I don't know. So I don't want to use it. Then again, maybe that's your spark. It doesn't have to be the word classical. It could be Catholic liberal education. It could be classical liberal education. It could be Renaissance education. You could look back to Greek education, the philosophers. Grab on to some little switch, some little hook that helps you redefine Catholic education. Maybe not redefine it, but re-enliven it. The motto of this school, to restore all things in Christ. That's an ongoing call for us. Well, let's restore what we understand about our Catholic education. We talk about lifelong learners. Are we still lifelong learners? We're wanting our students to be. Are we? Well, let's look back at that heritage that Dr. Hecker mentioned. And let's use this weird word or these weird words to click that switch and to start to reflect on what the beauty and fullness of our inheritance is. Because it's incredible.
So here's one of the challenges, at least for me, right? You both explained your background, and thank you. Will, you grew up in a home where the classics were a routine part of your life. Here's the challenge from my personal perspective, right? Which is to say, I was a Colorado State University grad. I went there to fish. So, but listening to you describe your own educational journeys, it's a lot different than most of us who came out of, I would guess the majority probably came out of a public college setting, education training through that system that was entirely secular. And so that's our understanding of how the education system works. How do we translate now from that paradigm where most of us came out of, what we were formed and shaped in, to this recapturing paradigm? How does one go about doing that when you're not trained or schooled or brought up in that at all?
I would concur on a lot of that. I forgot to mention that I started off working with this fellow down in Texas. It was one of my first teaching jobs. And I went on from there to teach at Trinity School, and then I helped to found a school in Plymouth, Minnesota called Providence Academy. So I was always working from schools that were either from the ground up or were already established. When I came to this most recent gig that I'm working at, it was a school that already had an ethos. And so a lot of what I was trying to do was to help teachers transition, just as you all are now, to this new model. And I found that, and this may seem familiar to you, I found that a lot of the resistance, if you will, was from teachers was they didn't know what they were supposed to do, and they were a little bit intimidated by it. It was kind of scary because it was such a big thing, or it seemed such a big thing. And the things that I think worked for us, because we've come a long way in a year. Last year, my biggest concern in October was to keep kids from chasing each other with scissors, jumping over desks, and fist fighting. That was my big concern. My big concern this year is whether or not to teach Beowulf in 4 weeks or in 5. And that's a huge difference because I'm not dealing with a lot of the issues now that I did last year. So concretely, how did we go about changing all that? There are some very concrete things that we can do. One of them, as you mentioned, is have conferences. We instituted a monthly get-together of teachers to talk about an article. We'd find an article by Dorothy Sayers or C.S. Lewis or Tolkien, and we'd get together and we'd talk about it. And that bore a lot of fruit. Also, I would suggest, if you can, get somebody who is somewhat classically based, who asks a lot of questions. Either somebody who is obnoxious, like a gadfly, or someone charming like myself. Get them into your faculty so that they go around and start asking questions of people in different disciplines. Because a lot of times, it's hard to say, how do I get the classical thing going? It's easy in history, I think, and in literature, theology, philosophy to do that. But how do you get classical education in mathematics? Mathematics hasn't seen change for thousands of years. How do you get classical education into, say, kindergarten? Kindergartners aren't going to go around, quoting Shakespeare and stuff. They can barely say, can I go to the bathroom? I can't, But get somebody on the faculty who asks questions, because oftentimes the conversations among faculty end up bearing a great deal of fruit. I'll give you a classic example. See what I did there? I'll give you a classical example. I was talking with students, and one girl says, I don't know what numbers are. And then one kid made fun of him. You don't know what numbers are? And I said, I'm 48. I don't know what numbers are. And it's not just because I'm, literature guy. It's I don't know what numbers are. And the kids were like, you don't know what numbers are, Mr. Lasser? It's 1, 2, 3. And I said, no, those are noises. And so one kid comes up, he's writing on the board furiously. And I said, no, that's grease on a board. Show me a 3. Show me a 5. They couldn't do it. And I said, I bet you anything the guy that we just hired, the classical mathematician, if you ask Mr. Blackhawk what numbers are, he probably could say the same thing. He doesn't know. So later on, I said, Mr. Blackhawk, what are numbers? And he laughed. Because it's a 15-year conversation between the two of us. We've been working together, Blackhawk and I, for 15 years. And he says he doesn't really know what they are either. Well, that grew in this other guy, this younger fellow who's working with us, fantastic mathematician. But he never thought about that before. He'd done functions, and he'd done trigonometry, he'd done calculus, he'd done algebra, and he never thought about what he was doing. What are numbers? Where are numbers? So we started talking about it, and what it came down to was, look, either numbers are something you're discovering, they already exist, or numbers are a pure fabrication of the human mind. And I said, well, which one do you think you are, Schultz? And he said, well, I think they definitely exist. I think they're part of the mind of God. And I said, well, you would be a realist. And others who said otherwise would be nominalists in the scholastic debate of the 13th century. And all of a sudden he's like, whoa, that's still going on. Oh, you're darn right it is. The nominalists have mostly won, but there's still this realist thing that somehow numbers are out there. Well, that conversation was extremely fruitful because this young man, this young teacher who I really admire as a math teacher, was having a hard time getting that classical thing into his room, and now he's thinking about this as the issue. What are we about when we do numbers? Why do we do algebra? Are we building bridges? Is that it? Are we balancing checkbooks? Is that it? That's so much dust, as Thomas Aquinas said, straw. What are numbers if they aren't a language for understanding the divine? And if you think of them that way, then you think of them in the classical mode. There are some other concrete things to pass your way. If you are, I find with a lot of teachers that reading Plato, reading Aristotle, reading Boethius, reading Descartes, this is tough stuff. That is some meaty material. So I find it's very helpful to go and get sort of the synopsis. I would recommend going, for instance, on videos. There's a great video called The School of Life. It's a what do you call it, a YouTube site where they have a number of videos, and they give you little synopses of what eudaimonia is. I didn't know what eudaimonia was. I mean, I read about it, but I didn't know what it was until I saw this video. And they talk about eudaimonia, which, by the way, is the purpose and end goal of education. So why I didn't know it, I felt like a total, well, there's a word for it. I felt like, bad, because I didn't know this. Eudaimonia is the purpose and end goal of education. Okay, great. School of Life, great YouTube site. Another great YouTube site is Lessons from the Screenplay. Now there, that guy analyzes videos, he analyzes movies, and he does so in a classical way. He looks at the structure, he breaks them down. He basically does a literary analysis of what a movie looks like. And it's fascinating, because you never thought about it before. You know, you see these movies. He was doing one on Arrival. The movie was Arrival. If you've seen that movie, it's a humdinger. It's quite the movie. And he does a great breakdown of what language does for us in the movie. So I'd recommend that. I would recommend, of course, having access to what you are offering, you know, and I'd say avail yourself of what's out there in terms of these websites, conversations, synopses of these things. And then when you feel ready for it, then go and tackle a piece of big literature, you know, tackle the Republic. Look at Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Look at the Constellation of Philosophy. Because if you try to take on if you try to eat a whale sandwich, you know how to eat a whale sandwich, right? One bite at a time. Yeah. If you try to eat the whale sandwich all at once, it gives you dyspepsia, and you don't want that. You know, one bite at a time. A little bit of mayonnaise, it's great. But if you try to eat the whole thing at once, it's gonna kill you. Okay, so that would be my advice. Concrete. You look at these websites. Look at. I have a ton of them, by the way. I just don't want to go on. In my OCD heaven, I collect all these things, and my computer is like almost filled with all these different websites and the like that help out. So I'm going to quit.
Yes. You want to? Yes, we will have time for questions. Yes, in fact, that's exactly where I was going. And this is a really good time to engage in the question. So yes, please, sister. Okay. So for the sake of the recording that we're doing for this session, to repeat your question, essentially it's, what is the difference that Michael or Will have seen in children or students who have been educated in a classical type of curriculum versus the more traditional, or what we would understand as the common type of curriculum? How has that been liberating, or in what ways has that been liberating?
I had a student who went off and fought with the military in the Iraq War, and he said that when he was over there were long periods of boredom, you know, a lot of tedious, and it was a very demoralizing situation for a lot of guys. And he found himself in the middle of that thinking about, of all things, Achilles, the hero. Yeah, no. And he thought about Achilles, and he suddenly found himself recovering whole passages from the Iliad that he read with me. And he wrote to me, and he thanked me for that. And I was very moved by that. He's gone on now, he has a family, he has 3 kids. But he said that in the midst of this dusty, smelly situation they were in, with just constant boredom and occasional moments of great terror, he said that it was very comforting to think back that other people in history had done this before, that other people had experienced this, and that there was artwork even made of it. I think, if anything, the liberal arts liberates because it takes us out of the tyranny of the present. It allows us to think about things that have gone on for eons, to think about things that are beyond the mundane and daily grind of our existence. And by doing that, by having a language, because that's how I see it, it's a language for thinking about this, we find ourselves capable of detaching from the anger or the fury or the boredom or just the depression that all of us have to deal with every day, to be able to think about things that really are ennobling, beautiful, wonderful. I think if nothing else, to me, that's a liberating benefit that I cherish very much.